The men of Sparta were raised for war. Their wives were raised to survive it. When a Spartan man fell in battle, his death was honored, but his wife was not comforted. No tears, no shrines, no mourning allowed. Instead, she became property of the state again, returned not as a widow, but as a vessel to be emptied, reassigned, and broken all over again in the name of Sparta. And for one woman named Eirene, the death of her husband was only the beginning of what the city demanded. The bronze disc arrived before sunrise, still wet with wax, pressed with the insignia of Sparta's war council. No messenger, no words, just a token placed at the door the silent way Spartan wives learned their husbands had died. Eirene stared at it for a long time before picking it up. She already knew. The night before, she had dreamed of the ocean washing away his footprints. Now the seal confirmed it. Damarian was gone. She sat in silence, hands flat on the cold stone floor, and listened to the sounds of the city waking up around her. But she did not cry. Crying was a betrayal. Instead, she reached for her crimson mantle and fastened it over her shoulders, then walked to the inner courtyard to await the summoning. By mid-morning, 2 young boys, not soldiers, but orphans of other dead warriors, arrived to escort her to the Black Court. The building had no name on its wall, only a stone carving of a woman with her eyes closed and mouth sewn shut. Eirene stepped inside and was led past long marble corridors until she stood before 3 elders cloaked in black. They did not look at her. One unrolled a scroll and read, "Your husband, Damarian, died in focus. You have 7 days to prepare for the rite of stillness. If you refuse or fail, your name will be erased from the citizen rolls, and you will be exiled beyond Taygetus." No explanation, no moment to breathe. She was dismissed before she could speak. On her way out, one of the orphan boys quietly placed a folded cloth in her hand. It was Damarian's headband, stiff with blood, smelling of ash. She did not flinch. As the door closed behind her, Eirene held the cloth to her chest and walked home through the narrow alleys, where other women pretended not to see her. In Sparta, a widow was already a ghost, and if she could not pass the trial that awaited her, she would become one in truth. The day of the rite began before the sun. A servant knocked once on the wooden door and left without speaking, leaving behind a folded tunic of deep gray and a plain pair of sandals, both symbols of mourning stripped of emotion. Eirene dressed slowly, her fingers moving with the precision of someone preparing not for ritual, but for battle. She did not braid her hair. She did not wear perfume. She was not allowed to. Spartan law demanded that her body become an object of silence, without vanity or voice. When she stepped outside, the sky was still the color of cold iron. 2 guards were waiting to escort her to the sanctuary of shields. As she walked, she could feel the eyes of other women through shuttered windows, wives who had once stood where she stood now, and daughters who feared they soon would. No one offered prayers. No one whispered hope. Only silence. The sanctuary stood at the edge of the city, where the wind from the mountain passed through broken columns like a warning. At its center, Damarian's armor had already been placed on a stone plinth, the bronze chestplate still bearing the dents of battle, the helmet resting like a crown over a skull that was no longer there. Eirene was ordered to kneel before it and remain there until nightfall. She was not to speak, not to move, not to cry. Her knees pressed against the marble floor as if it were ice. A priestess stepped forward and painted the skin beneath her eyes with thick black coal. If she wept, the stain would reveal her weakness. If she trembled, the watchers would see. The trial was meant to test her worth not to the gods, but to the state. A Spartan woman who could not bear grief in silence was a liability. Her emotions were a threat. Her tears could shame the name of the man who died. Hours passed like centuries. The wind picked up. Dust settled into her lashes. Her back stiffened. Her legs ached. But she did not move. At midday, the sun beat down like a punishment. At dusk, shadows lengthened over her hands like creeping fingers. Her mind went numb. She thought of Damarian's voice, of how he used to sing under his breath while sharpening his spear. She thought of his hands, the way he once touched her as if she were made of something rare. She could not feel her own feet. Still, She did not cry. When the bell finally rang from the tower, signaling that the trial had ended, her body refused to rise. It took 2 women to lift her by the arms. One of them looked into her face and found no tears, only coal. Unbroken, unsmeared, in silence, Eirene had passed. But something inside her had been buried, where even Sparta could not see. On the 3rd night, as the moon hung thin and sharp above the city like a blade, Eirene was summoned again. This time, she was led not through the streets, but down a narrow corridor carved beneath the sanctuary of shields, a place few ever saw, and none spoke of aloud. The air grew colder with each step, and the walls sweated with salt, as if the stone itself remembered every woman who had walked this path before. At the end of the corridor stood a chamber lit only by a single oil lamp. There were no guards, only 5 women cloaked in white linen, their faces veiled, their hands stained with ash. These were the witnesses' widows who had passed the trial and had been made into instruments of judgment. They did not speak, they only watched. Eirene was stripped of her tunic and given a ceremonial robe dyed pale with chalk and sea salt. It clung to her skin like mist. Her hair was unbound and combed with a thin bronze blade, a ritual meant to reveal whether she trembled. She didn't, not even when the blade scraped against her scalp. The witnesses circled her slowly, eyes fixed on the curve of her hands, the stillness of her jaw, the depth of breath in her chest. To them, grief was a beast with many hiding places. If it twitched beneath the fingernails, if it flinched in the throat, they would find it. Then came the speaking. Eirene was ordered to recite the names of her ancestors, from the mother who bore her to the first warrior of her bloodline. She spoke each name without pause, her voice low but steady. She was not allowed to use the name of her husband, not yet. That name belonged to Sparta now. When the last name left her mouth, the witnesses pressed ash against her forehead in silence. One stepped forward and removed her veil. She was older, perhaps 50, but her eyes were the color of rusted iron. Her face bore no softness, only lines carved by obedience. She raised a small jar of scented oil and anointed Irene's lips not as a blessing, but as a seal. For the next 7 days, Eirene was forbidden to speak, not to servants, not to neighbors, not even to her children. It was called the widow's silence, a tradition Sparta claimed taught discipline and preserved the dignity of the dead. But every woman knew the truth. It was not to honor the husband, it was to erase the wife. Eirene was led out the way she came, barefoot, robe dragging behind her. As she reached the surface, the wind hit her like a blade of glass, but she did not shiver. The silence had already begun to settle in her bones, turning words to dust before they could leave her tongue. And so she walked home through a city that no longer looked at her, bearing a silence that weighed more than the shield her husband once carried. The 4th day arrived not with mourning, but with a summons. A scroll was delivered to Irene's doorstep, pressed with the red wax of the ephors 5 men who governed Sparta with eyes like hawks and hearts carved from stone. The message inside bore no greeting. It simply read, "You are of age. You are of womb. Your new oikos will be assigned." In Sparta, a widow under 40 was not free. She was not given time to heal or allowed the dignity of solitude. Her body belonged to the city, and the city had decided that she must bear more sons. Grief was a luxury only the childless could afford. The rest were required to rebuild, with or without permission. At dusk, she was summoned to the registry hall, where widows were presented like ledgers and reassigned like cattle. The chamber was long, with pillars carved to resemble spears. Dozens of women stood in silence, each wrapped in gray, their eyes low, their hands tucked beneath their robes. At the front of the hall sat the matchmaker, an old man whose duty was to preserve bloodlines and reassign property. Eirene stepped forward when her name was called. Her fate had already been sealed. She was to marry Lysandros, the 15-year-old cousin of her late husband. The boy stood to her right, trembling, his ceremonial red robe hanging too loose on his narrow frame. He did not look at her. He couldn't. His mouth had never tasted war, His hands had never touched a woman, and yet, by law, he was now her future. She was not asked if she consented. The matchmaker spoke of honor, legacy, duty to Sparta. Then he marked her wrist with a thin line of iron dust, the symbol of reassignment. It was not binding in spirit, only in law. But that was all that mattered here. As she turned to leave, one of the ephors stepped forward and placed a small wooden token in her hand. It bore the symbol of twin snakes, fertility and silence. She was instructed to keep it beside her bed until the first child was conceived. Only then would her household be complete. Only then would she be absolved of widowhood. That night, Eirene sat alone by the hearth, watching the flame flicker across the stone walls. The boy would not arrive until the end of her silence. Until then, she was to prepare the house, clean the threshold, and sleep beneath a new name she had not chosen. She pressed the wooden token between her palms, feeling its weight dig into her skin. It did not hurt, but it did not leave a mark either. That was Sparta's way: pain without wound, shame without blood, command without sound. And though her voice remained buried, her thoughts screamed like wild dogs in a cage. Her life was no longer her own. It had been traded for legacy, for law, for a boy with shaking hands and a name she did not want to learn. Before the sun crested the hills of Taygetus, Eirene was already awake. The silence had soaked into her skin by now, making her breath slow and her body stiff. The final test awaited her, one last ritual before she could be received as a widow worthy of Sparta. It was not a prayer, it was not a funeral, it was a walk, the shield walk. At dawn, she would carry her dead husband's shield through the agora, the public square where merchants whispered and children were taught to bite back tears. The shield was not light, it was full bronze, scarred from years of war, and wide enough to cover the length of her torso. But it was not the weight of the metal that made women fall. It was the weight of watching eyes. When she arrived, the square was already lined with onlookers. No one clapped, no one wept. They stood in silence, watching her approach the base of the steps where the shield lay wrapped in black cloth. A priestess unwrapped it slowly, like revealing a wound, and placed it in Eirene's arms. She staggered, only for a moment. Her hands found the grip where Damarian's had once held firm. The rules were simple. She could not stop. She could not speak. And above all, she could not drop the shield. If it fell, if her knees buckled, or her grip failed, she would be deemed unfit. Her husband's name would be scratched from the public rolls, and her children would be stripped of honor. There were no second chances. This was not a performance. It was a sentence. A final chance to prove that her silence, her suffering, had value to the city. Each step echoed through the square like thunder in a tomb. The shield pressed into her chest, stealing air with every breath. Her arms began to shake, her shoulders screamed. Still,